Amara would later remember the cold not as a feeling, but as a presence. It was a living thing that had wrapped itself around the city, a predator stalking the thin and the weak, and its teeth were currently sunk deep into the flesh of her hope. She held her son Elias, a 7-day-old miracle bundled in a donated blanket that smelled of institutional soap, and felt the creature's icy breath on the back of her neck. They were standing on a wind-whipped street corner, the gray afternoon bleeding into an even grayer dusk, and the final door had just been slammed in her face. The shelter was full. The program had no more funding. The system had no more room. For Amara and her newborn child, the world had shrunk to the size of a single unforgiving patch of concrete. It was in that moment, when the chasm of absolute zero opened beneath her, that she learned a person could be erased from the world long before they stopped breathing. She was a ghost with a heartbeat, a mother with nothing to offer her child but the failing warmth of her own body. That was the moment she inherited the fire station for $1. The letter, a crumpled piece of city-crested paper she'd been carrying for a week as a laughable, impossible dream, was a lottery ticket she never believed could be a winner. A pilot program, a homesteading act for the forgotten, $1 for one abandoned, condemned, forgotten property, and her name, by some bureaucratic miracle or clerical error, had been drawn. $1 for a mountain of brick and ghosts, a place the city had given up on, a place for people the city had given up on. If you're watching this, I hope our stories can connect. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's good to know we're not alone in the quiet corners of the world. Now back to the cold, and the key that felt less like a key and more like a shard of ice in her trembling hand. The building stood at the end of a derelict street, a brick behemoth from another century. Fire Station Number 7. Its windows were boarded over like blind eyes, and graffiti snaked up its walls in faded, desperate colors. The great red doors, wide enough to birth engines of salvation, were chained and padlocked, a declaration of finality. Her entrance was a small, unassuming door to the side, its lock so rusted she thought the key would snap. But with a groan that sounded like the building itself was sighing in its sleep, the lock turned. The air that rushed out to meet her was thick with the dust of decades, a scent of decay, cold stone, and something else, something like sleeping history. She stepped inside, Elias clutched to her chest, and the door swung shut behind them, with a definitive, echoing boom that sealed them in. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in from all sides. It was not merely the absence of light, it was a presence, just like the cold. But this darkness was different. It was a shelter. It was a beginning. Outside, she was a problem to be solved, a statistic to be ignored. Inside this forgotten tomb, she was a resident. She was home. The single dollar, her last dollar, had purchased not just a ruin, but a sliver of existence. She ran her free hand along the wall, the brick rough and cold, and felt the faintest vibration, the deep, resonant hum of the city moving on without her. But it was distant now, muffled. For the first time in a long time, the noise of the world was on the other side of a wall. She took a breath, the dust tickling her throat, and whispered into the soft fuzz on her son's head. "We're okay, little man. We're okay." It was the first lie she told him, and the most important truth she had ever told herself. The building seemed to hold its breath around them, a silent, uncertain witness to their arrival. High above, unseen in the oppressive dark, the bell tower pointed a finger at the bruised sky, guarding a secret it had kept for nearly a century, waiting for someone desperate enough to listen to its silence. The weight of the structure felt immense, a colossal skeleton settling around her, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Amara felt not like she had found a home, but that she had been swallowed whole. Yet as Elias stirred against her, a tiny, warm anchor in the cold, vast dark, she knew this was it. There was no other door to knock on, no other path to take. This mountain of brick and shadow was their fortress or their tomb, and the choice was no longer hers to make. The only direction was forward, deeper into the heart of the station, deeper into the unknown. The first 24 hours were a campaign waged against the cold. The fire station was a cavern of frigid air, its vast open-engine bay a wind tunnel for drafts that snaked in through 100 unseen cracks. Amara's mission was singular, to carve out a small pocket of survivable space. She moved with the slow, deliberate energy of someone who knew that wasted motion was a luxury she could not afford. Her only light came from the thin, watery daylight that filtered through the grime on a high unboarded window, a single dusty spotlight in the cathedral of gloom. It illuminated a world frozen in time. The ghosts of fire engines were outlined in the dust on the concrete floor. The brass poles descending from the second story were tarnished to a dull, murky brown, their gleam long since surrendered to neglect. Along one wall, old lockers stood ajar like silent sentinels, their doors hanging off their hinges. Inside one, she found what felt like a treasure, a thick, wool-lined firefighter's coat. It was impossibly heavy and smelled of smoke, sweat, and time. But when she wrapped it around herself and Elias, it was a shield. The cold, for the first time, receded from a direct assault to a distant siege. Her haven became a small office just off the main bay. Its door was still intact, its window boarded tight. With the heavy coat and the few blankets she possessed, she created a nest on the floor in the corner, furthest from the door. It was there she nursed Elias, his small, hungry mouth a fierce affirmation of life in this place of endings. The silence was the other enemy. It was a deep, resonant silence that amplified every sound. The drip of water from a leaky pipe became a rhythmic drumbeat, counting out the seconds of her uncertainty. The scuttling of a mouse in the walls was a thunderous intrusion, and above it all, there was the groan of the building itself, the sound of old timber and settling brick, as if the station were a great sleeping beast dreaming of its past glories. During one of Elias's fitful naps, Amara ventured to explore, not out of curiosity, but out of a primal need to understand the geography of her new world. She needed to know its weaknesses, its potential threats. The ground floor was a labyrinth of small rooms behind the main bay. A kitchen with a rust-stained sink, a recreation room with the ghostly outlines of a pool table on the floor, a washroom where the porcelain of the sinks was shattered. Everything of value had been stripped long ago, leaving only the heaviest, most broken remnants. It felt like walking through the ribcage of a whale washed ashore. It was on the second floor that the character of the place began to change. She climbed a wide wooden staircase, the treads groaning under her slight weight. Here were the dormitories, a long room lined with the simple iron frames of beds. Sunlight, stronger here, streamed through the gaps in the boarded windows, creating bars of light and shadow on the floor. It was a place of rest, of waiting, and at the very end of the hall, a final, narrower staircase spiraled upwards. A simple, hand-painted sign, the letters faded but still legible, read, "Tower Access. Chief's authorization only." The bell tower. She hadn't given it much thought from the outside other than as a piece of archaic architecture. But from within, it felt different. It was the building's spine, its connection to the sky. A strange pull, a sense of importance, emanated from that direction. She felt a draft, colder than anywhere else in the building, whispering down the spiral stairs. It wasn't the rambling, directionless draft of a derelict building. It was focused, a cold exhalation. She stood at the base of the stairs, looking up into the darkness of the narrow passage. Elias was asleep in her arms, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm against her chest. The tower felt like a challenge, a part of the building that remained aloof, watchful. It wasn't just another room. It was a destination, a purpose. She decided against climbing. Not yet. It was too dark, too uncertain. Survival was about controlling the variables, and the tower was a massive unknown quantity. She returned to her small office, her makeshift nest, and as she settled down for the night, the city lights creating a faint, orange glow against the boarded window, she couldn't shake the feeling of the tower. It loomed over the station, a silent question mark. That night, as a winter storm raged outside, the wind howling around the eaves of the station, a new sound joined the building's chorus. It was a low, resonant hum, almost too deep to be a sound, more of a vibration that traveled through the concrete floor and up into her bones. It seemed to come from directly above, from the heart of the tower. It wasn't menacing, it was patient. Amara held Elias tighter, listening to the storm, to the groaning building, and to the strange, deep hum from the tower. She was a castaway on a strange island, and she was beginning to suspect that the island itself was alive. Weeks bled into a month. Amara and the fire station settled into a routine, a quiet dance of survival. She learned the building's rhythms, where the morning light first struck, which pipes groaned the loudest when the temperature dropped. The precise path of the drafts she needed to block with rags and old newspapers she found in a forgotten storage closet. She had managed to get a small, portable propane heater working, a gift from a sympathetic outreach worker who had bent the rules to help her. It created a small circle of warmth in the office, a sanctuary against the persistent chill. The station was no longer just a structure. It was a partner in her survival, a flawed but formidable shell protecting her and her son. But the tower remained an enigma. The strange, cold draft from its stairwell was a constant reminder of its presence, a secret the building was keeping. The low hum she'd heard during the storm had not returned, but its memory lingered, a single resonant note in the silence. The need to know what was up there grew from a flicker of curiosity into a gnawing necessity. Securing her shelter meant knowing all of it, every corner, every weakness. The tower was the biggest unknown. One clear, cold afternoon, with Elias sleeping soundly in a makeshift bassinet she had fashioned from a wooden crate, she decided it was time. She armed herself with a heavy, rusted flashlight she'd found and a crowbar from an old tool locker, its weight a clumsy reassurance in her hand. The climb up the spiral staircase was a journey into another time. The air grew colder, thicker with the smell of dust and dry rot. The stone steps were worn in the middle, each one a shallow bowl carved by the boots of men long dead. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, brushed against her face, and she flinched at every touch, her mind conjuring spiders the size of her hand. The flashlight beam cut a nervous, bouncing circle in the oppressive darkness. After what felt like an eternity of winding upwards, the staircase opened into a small, square room. This was the clock room, the heart of the tower. In the center of the space stood the massive, silent mechanism of a four-faced clock, its gears and weights a complex metal skeleton. Light filtered in through the translucent, dirty glass of the clock faces on each wall, casting a cathedral-like, ethereal glow on the dust motes dancing in the air. Above this room, she knew, was the belfry itself. Another, shorter flight of wooden steps led to a heavy trapdoor in the ceiling, but something held her here. The draft was stronger, and it wasn't coming from the belfry above. It was coming from the wall behind the clock mechanism. She squeezed past the silent gears, her flashlight beam tracing the brickwork. It was old, solid, the mortar crumbling in places. And then she saw it, a section of the wall about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, where the pattern of the bricks was subtly different. The mortar was a slightly different shade, newer, and the bricks themselves, if you look closely, lacked the same centuries-old patina as their neighbors. It was a patch, a very old, very expert patch, but a patch nonetheless. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She ran her hand over the surface. It was perfectly flat, perfectly solid. She knocked on it. The sound was a dull, solid thud, just like the rest of the wall. But the draft, she could feel it now, a tiny, icy whisper seeping from the hairline crack of the mortar. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the patch, pushing. Nothing. She brought the crowbar forward, hesitating. This was an act of violation. She was no longer just a resident. She was becoming an intruder in the station's history. But the need to know, the instinct that had driven her this far, was stronger than her fear. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the finest of cracks at the top of the patch section and leaned into it with all her weight. For a moment, nothing happened. The building seemed to resist, to hold its secret tight. Then, with a deep, grinding screech of stone against stone, a sound that sent a shower of dust and mortar down onto her head, the top edge of the section moved. It moved inward. It wasn't a patch. It was a door, a hidden, brick-faced door. Her breath caught in her throat. She worked the crowbar down the side, leveraging it with frantic energy. The grinding sound was louder now, an ancient protest against the violation. Finally, with a low groan, the entire section swung inward into a darkness beyond. It opened not into a small closet or a hollow space, but into a passageway, black and absolute. And there, at the end of the short passage, caught in the wavering beam of her flashlight, was something that did not belong. Something that defied all logic. It was a wall of dark, riveted steel. A circle of polished metal was set into its center, the dial of a massive, ancient vault. The sight of the vault door was a shock that traveled up her spine and settled as a cold knot in her stomach. It was an impossibility, a hallucination born of cold and desperation. A bank vault hidden deep within the brick heart of a forgotten fire station's bell tower. The air in the short passageway was stale and dead, the smell of sealed time. The vault door was immense, a perfect circle of steel at least a foot thick, set into a frame of the same metal that seemed to have been fused with the very bones of the building. In the center, the combination dial, a heavy brass wheel with numbers and letters etched into its surface, gleamed dully in her flashlight beam. Below it was a formidable handle, a thick bar of steel that looked as if it would take the strength of 10 men to turn. Amara stood there for a long time, the flashlight trembling in her hand, her mind struggling to reconcile what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't part of a fire station. This was a fortress. It was a tomb. Whose secret was this? And why here? The sheer effort and expense required to construct such a thing in this place spoke of a purpose so profound it terrified her. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the steel. It was cold, deeper than the ambient chill of the tower, a cold that seemed to come from its core. It was utterly immovable, a solid piece of forever. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She stumbled back into the clock room, the hidden door still gaping open, and leaned against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The secret of the tower was not a structural quirk or a forgotten piece of equipment. It was a deliberate, monumental mystery. For the next few days, she tried to forget it. She focused on Elias, on reinforcing their small nest, on the simple, urgent tasks of survival. She told herself it was none of her business. It was a relic of a past that had nothing to do with her. But the open door in the tower was like a wound in the building, and she could feel its presence from every room. The station was no longer just a shelter. It was a puzzle box, and she was living inside it. The temptation was relentless. At night, as Elias slept, her mind would climb the spiral stairs and stand before the steel door. She would trace the numbers on the dial, her fingers imagining the feel of the cold brass. The question of what lay behind it became an obsession. Was it empty? Was it a decoy? Or was it full? The thought was so vast, so dangerous, she could barely let herself form it. One evening, driven by an impulse she couldn't control, she went back up. This time she brought a small stool and a notebook. She sat in front of the dial, her flashlight propped on the floor, and simply looked. The dial had 100 numbers and 26 letters. The possibilities were functionally infinite. It was hopeless. Yet she felt a strange sense of ownership, of responsibility. This secret was hers now. It had been passed to her by the simple act of her presence, her desperation. She began to search the clock room for a clue. She ran her hands over every brick, every gear of the clock mechanism. She swept the floor, sifting through the thick dust with her fingers, finding nothing but crumbled mortar and the husks of dead insects. Days turned into a week. Her search expanded. She scoured the entire station, her quest giving her a new purpose. In the chief's old office on the second floor, a room she had previously ignored because its floorboards were rotted through in places, she found a clue. Tucked away on a high shelf in a closet, behind a stack of disintegrating city record books, was a small, leather-bound firefighter's log. It was from 1929. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. It was mostly filled with mundane entries, equipment checks, fire calls, shift changes. The fire chief at the time, according to the flyleaf, was a man named Alistair Finch. She read through the entries, her hope dwindling with each turned page. It was a record of a world long gone. And then, on the very last page, a page that was otherwise blank, she found a series of notations that were different from the rest. It wasn't a log entry. It was a sequence of numbers and letters, written in a slightly different hand, a more deliberate, almost artistic script. 7L34R, 18L Finch. It was not a code, it was a combination. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the last word. Finch. A name. A signature. Was it a reminder? Or was it the final part of the sequence? She raced back up the tower stairs, the logbook clutched in her hand like a sacred text. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the flashlight steady. She stood before the vault, the book open on the stool beside her. She took a deep breath, the cold, dusty air filling her lungs. She placed her hand on the heavy brass dial. The metal was smooth, cold, expectant. She began to turn it, left to 7. The tumblers inside the massive door made a soft, oily click. Right, past 7 to 34. Another deeper click. Left, past 34 to 18. A third click, sharper this time. Her breath was trapped in her chest. Now for the last part. Finch. She searched the dial. There were letters interspersed with the numbers. She slowly spelled out the name, turning the dial to F, then I, then N, then C, then H, alternating the direction each time. With the final turn to H, a sound echoed in the small stone room, a sound so loud it made her jump back. It was a deep, resonant thud from within the mechanism, the sound of a final, massive bolt retracting. For a moment there was silence. Then with an almost imperceptible groan, the great steel door moved a fraction of an inch, breaking a seal that had held for the better part of a century. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, of metal, of wealth itself. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It moved slowly, ponderously, its weight immense, swinging inward into perfect, waiting darkness. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness of the vault, and for a long moment, Amara's brain refused to process what it was seeing. It was a space no larger than a walk-in closet, but it was filled, floor to ceiling, with a landscape of impossible wealth. The light glinted off the soft, heavy sheen of gold bars, hundreds of them, stacked in neat, interlocking rows like bricks of solidified sunlight. They formed the foundation of this dragon's hoard. On top of them, and filling wooden crates that lined the walls, were stacks and stacks of currency. Not modern bills, but old notes, their paper aged to a creamy yellow. There were United States gold certificates, bearer bonds from corporations that likely no longer existed, and currencies from a dozen different countries. And in the very center of the room, on a small, purpose-built pedestal, sat a collection of leather satchels, bulging at the seams, their buckles tarnished with age. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it was a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. This wasn't money. It was an idea. It was a weight. It was the distilled power and fear of a generation, hidden away from the ravages of the Great Depression, a secret so dense it had bent the reality of this old building around it. The number, a figure she would later calculate with shaking hands and a dawning sense of horror, was $389 million. It was a sum so astronomical it had no meaning. It was a weapon. It was a cure. It was a curse. Her first reaction was not joy or even relief. It was a profound, soul-crushing terror. This discovery did not solve her problems. It multiplied them by a factor she couldn't comprehend. The simple, brutal calculus of survival, finding food, warmth, safety for her son, was suddenly replaced by a moral equation of terrifying complexity. Who did this belong to? Why was it here? What was she, a homeless woman with a newborn, supposed to do with a fortune that could alter the course of nations? She felt like an ant that had stumbled into the engine room of the gods. She backed out of the vault, pulling the heavy door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack, as if completely sealing it again would make it unreal. She stumbled down the stairs from the tower, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling. Back in her small, warm office, she picked up Elias, holding his small, sleeping body against her own. His needs were so simple, so pure. He needed warmth, food, love. He was the anchor of her reality. But the secret she now carried was a universe away from that reality. It was a poison. It would corrupt everything it touched. For hours she just sat there, rocking her son, the hum of the small heater the only sound. The weight of the golden paper in the tower above seemed to press down on the entire building, on her, on the fragile life in her arms. She thought about taking just one gold bar. One. It would be enough to get a car, an apartment, to build a new life far away from here. No one would ever know. The temptation was a sweet, insidious whisper. She could erase her past, her poverty, her invisibility. She could give Elias everything she never had. But then what? The secret would follow her. The fear of its discovery would be a constant shadow. And what of the man who built this vault? Alistair Finch. This was his legacy. It was his story. By finding it, had she not inherited the responsibility of its ending? The money was not a gift, it was a test. It was a burden passed from one guardian to the next. The fire station was no longer a simple shelter. It had transformed. It was a vault, and she was its keeper. The line between salvation and damnation had become terrifyingly thin, and she was standing right on it. The next morning, she did not go back up to the tower. Instead, she took the crowbar, and, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she painstakingly wedged the hidden brick door back into its frame, hammering it shut, scraping mortar and dust into the cracks to conceal the seams as best she could. She was resealing the tomb, not to forget it, but to protect it, to protect herself. She understood now that the greatest danger was not the cold or the hunger. It was the fortune sleeping in the heart of her home. The world outside saw a homeless woman in a condemned building. But inside, Amara was the custodian of a king's ransom, a secret that made her the most powerful and the most vulnerable person in the entire city. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone with it. Life after the discovery was a paradox. Outwardly, nothing changed. Amara continued her daily struggle, her routine of survival. She measured out propane, carefully rationed the food she got from the outreach center, and spent her days tending to the simple, profound needs of her infant son. But inwardly, she was a different person, living in a different world. The knowledge of the vault was a constant, humming presence in the back of her mind. Every creak of the old station made her jump. Every shadow that flickered past the boarded windows seemed like a threat. She was living on a precipice, and the fear of falling was constant. She began to see the world through a lens of paranoia. The mail carrier who occasionally shoved junk mail through the slot in the main door was a spy. The city inspector who slapped a new condemnation notice on the wall was a scout. She was the guardian of a secret so immense that it warped her perception of everything. The money was a silent, demanding entity, and its first demand was absolute secrecy. One afternoon, about a month after she had sealed the vault, a car pulled up outside the station. It was a sleek, black sedan, the kind of car that didn't belong on this forgotten street. It hummed quietly at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the gray, weary facade of the firehouse. Amara watched through a small crack in the boards of a second-story window, her heart pounding. A man got out of the passenger side. He was not what she expected. He wasn't a thug or a government agent. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like a lawyer or a banker. He moved with an air of easy, predatory confidence. He didn't try the main doors. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the station, his gaze analytical, sweeping up from the foundation to the bell tower. He paused, his eyes lingering on the tower for a long moment, as if he could see through the brick, right to the steel heart of it. Amara shrank back from the window, her blood running cold. How could he know? It was impossible. He eventually came to the small side door she used. He knocked, the sound sharp and authoritative, echoing through the vast, empty space of the engine bay. She stood frozen in the upstairs hallway, holding Elias, who had started to fuss. She held a finger to his lips, her body rigid. The man knocked again, louder this time. "Hello?" he called out, his voice smooth and cultured. "City records show this property as occupied. I'm with the Landmark Preservation Society. I'd just like to ask a few questions about the building's historical integrity. Landmark Preservation Society. It sounded official, innocuous, but Amara's fear-sharpened instincts screamed that it was a lie. It was a key designed to fit a specific lock. He knocked a third time, then waited. She could hear the soft crunch of his expensive shoes on the gravel as he paced. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, she heard the car door open and close. The sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared. She didn't move for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded. The visit had changed everything. The threat was no longer a phantom of her paranoia. It was real. It had a face. It wore a tailored suit and drove a black car. She understood then that the secret of the vault was not entirely a secret. Someone else, somewhere, knew or suspected something. The money had a history, and that history was now reaching out to reclaim it. The man's focus on the tower was the most terrifying part. It couldn't be a coincidence. He had looked at it with a kind of proprietary interest, a knowing glance that had chilled her to the bone. The forces that were now stirring were not random. They were informed. They were powerful. They were the kind of people who did not give up easily. That night, sleep offered no escape. She dreamt of the man in the suit, his face a smiling, predatory mask. He was chipping away at the bricks of the tower with a golden hammer, and with every strike the entire station trembled, threatening to collapse on top of her and her son. She awoke in a cold sweat, Elias stirring in his crate beside her. The station was silent, the darkness absolute, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. The walls that had protected her now felt like the fragile shell of a treasure chest that someone was actively hunting. She was no longer just hiding from the world. She was hiding from a specific, unseen enemy, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the man in the black car would be back. This was only the beginning. The game had started, and she, a homeless single mother, was a player in it, whether she wanted to be or not. The stakes were not just her own survival anymore. The stakes were $389 million and the soul of the man who had hidden it. The visit from the man in the suit shattered Amara's fragile sense of security. She understood that ignorance was no longer a viable strategy. If she was to protect the vault, and by extension herself and her son, she needed to understand what she was protecting. She needed to know the story of Alistair Finch. Her search began not with the money but with the fire station itself. The building was the vessel, the context for the secret. To understand the treasure, she had to understand the chest it came in. She realized she needed help, a guide to the station's past. But who could she trust? The question circled her thoughts for days. The answer, she decided, lay not in power or influence, but in memory. She needed someone who remembered the city as it was, someone who was a part of its institutional memory, but no longer a part of its machinery. After a week of careful, discreet inquiries at the Central Library, using their public computers to search the city archives, she found a name: Captain Franklin Miller, retired. He was the last serving captain of Fire Station Number 7 before it was decommissioned in the late 1970s. An article she found mentioned he was the station's unofficial historian, a man who had collected its stories. Finding him was another challenge, but she eventually tracked him down to a small, tidy house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. He was an old man, well into his 80s, with sharp, clear eyes that had seen too much smoke and too much sorrow. He greeted her on his porch with a cautious but not unkind curiosity. She told him a carefully edited version of the truth, that she was the new resident of the station, part of a city homesteading program, and that she was interested in its history, hoping to honor it as she made it her home. She did not mention the vault. She did not mention Alistair Finch. She simply presented herself as someone who cared about the old building. Miller looked at her, his gaze taking in her worn clothes, the tired lines around her eyes, and the tiny bundled infant in her arms. He was silent for a long moment, and she felt her hope begin to drain away. Then a slow smile touched his lips. "Station number 7, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I'll be damned. Thought they'd have torn that old girl down by now. Glad they didn't. She's got good bones." He invited her in. His house was a museum of his life's work. Old photographs of firefighters lined the walls. A polished brass nozzle served as a doorstop. He made her a cup of tea, and as she cradled the warm mug, Ellis sleeping peacefully in her lap, she felt a sliver of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. For the first time in months, she was speaking to someone who wasn't from a bureaucracy, someone who didn't see her as a problem. Captain Miller was a born storyteller. He spoke of the station not as a building, but as a living entity. He told her about the Great Fire of '52, about the rookie who got stuck in the brass pole hole, about the legendary Christmas dinners they used to cook in the station's kitchen. His stories painted a vibrant picture of the community and camaraderie the station had once housed. Finally, Amara gently guided the conversation further back in time. "I found some old logbooks," she said, her voice carefully casual, "from the 20s and 30s. The fire chief then was a man named Alistair Finch." At the mention of the name, Miller's expression changed. The warm nostalgia in his eyes was replaced by something more complex, a mixture of respect and mystery. "Ah, the chief," he said, his voice dropping a little. "Now there was a man. Before my time, of course. He was a legend at the station. The old-timers used to talk about him like he was a king." He leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "Finch wasn't your usual civil servant. He came from old money, one of the city's founding families. They said he joined the fire department out of a sense of duty, not need. He loved the city, but he hated the corruption that was strangling it back then. The politicians, the bankers, he saw them all as arsonists of a different sort." Miller got up and went to a bookshelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound scrapbook. He flipped through the pages, which were filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. He stopped at one. The headline read, "Chief Finch Vanishes. Millions in family fortune unaccounted for." The article was dated 1931. "He disappeared," Miller said, his finger tapping the brittle paper, "right at the height of the Depression. One day he was at the station, the next he was gone. Left a note saying he was going abroad, but no one ever heard from him again. His family's fortune, which was considerable, vanished with him. Most people assumed he saw the crash coming, liquidated everything, and ran." Amara stared at the photograph of Finch in the newspaper. He was a man with a severe face, a sharp jaw, and eyes that seemed to look right through the camera, as if focused on a distant, troubling future. This was the man who had built the vault. He hadn't run. He had hidden. He had hidden his fortune right under the noses of the entire city, in the one place he controlled absolutely, the one place he trusted. "The old-timers," Miller continued, lost in the memory, "they had other theories. They said he didn't run. They said he'd converted his wealth into something permanent, something that couldn't be touched by the corrupt banks or the crooked politicians, something he intended for the city he loved, to be used when it was most needed. But they never knew what it was. It became a firehouse legend, the lost treasure of Chief Finch." Amara felt a shiver run down her spine. It was no longer just money in the tower. It was an endowment, a legacy, a weapon forged against the very forces she was now facing. Meeting Captain Miller had given the secret a soul. It now had a name, a face, and a purpose. As she left his house that evening, the weight on her shoulders felt different. It was no longer just the terrifying weight of a secret fortune. It was the weight of a man's last will and testament, a sacred trust placed in her hands by a ghost from half a century ago. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she could not, would not, let him down. The knowledge Captain Miller had given her was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it imbued the vault's contents with a noble purpose, transforming it from a mere treasure into a sacred trust. On the other, it cemented the reality of the forces arrayed against her. Alistair Finch had hidden his fortune from the corrupt and powerful of his time, and Amara had no doubt that their modern-day equivalents were the ones who had sent the man in the tailored suit. They were not just treasure hunters. They were the descendants of the very arsonists Finch had sought to thwart. A few weeks later, as she had known he would, the man returned. This time, he did not come alone. The black sedan was accompanied by a second vehicle, a nondescript van. The man in the suit, whose name she later learned was Mr. Davies, knocked on her door again. This time, Amara was prepared. She had spent the intervening weeks thinking, planning, steeling herself. She opened the door, just a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. Elias was strapped to her chest in a sling, a silent, sleeping witness. Davies smiled, a thin, predatory expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Good morning," he said, as if they were neighbors. "I see I've found you in. I am Julian Davies, a representative for the Argent Development Corporation." He had dropped the pretense of the Landmark Society. Argent Development. Amara recognized the name from the news. They were a ruthless, powerful firm known for buying up entire city blocks, erasing history and community in favor of glass and steel towers that catered to the ultra-wealthy. "We have a proposal for you," Davies continued, his voice smooth as oil. "Argent has acquired the deed to this entire block, every property, except this one. We are prepared to make you a significant offer to relocate. $5 million. He said the number casually, as if it were pocket change. Amara's heart stopped. $5 million. The sound of it echoed in the cavernous space behind her. It was a life-altering, world-changing sum of money. It was an escape. It was safety for Elias. It was a future free from cold, hunger, and fear. She could take that money, disappear, and leave the vault and its history behind. No one would blame her. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. The temptation was so strong, so seductive, it was almost a physical force, pulling her forward. She could taste the freedom. She could feel the warmth of a new life. All she had to do was say yes. She looked past Davies at the men waiting by the van. They were not smiling. They were there to underscore the seriousness of the offer. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a demand wrapped in a pretty package. For a fleeting second, she saw her future branch into two distinct paths. One was sunlit and easy, paved with Argent's money. The other was dark, uncertain, and fraught with danger, a path of loyalty to a dead man's wishes. She looked down at Elias, his face so peaceful, so innocent. What did she owe him? A life of ease, or a legacy of integrity? Could she take money from the very people Finch had fought against and call it a victory? The thought turned the $5 million from a promise into a poison. It was a bribe. It was a test of her character, the very test Finch must have anticipated his chosen heir would one day face. She thought of Captain Miller's stories, of a man who loved his city so much he had turned his back on his own class to protect it. She thought of the weight of the gold in the tower, not as a treasure, but as a responsibility. Her own struggles, her own poverty, had given her a perspective the men in suits could never understand. She knew what a city's forgotten people needed, because she was one of them. That knowledge, she realized, was the true key to the vault. "The property is not for sale," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. It was a statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the vault door itself. Davies' smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of annoyance, of disbelief crossed his face. He had expected desperation, not defiance. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone hardening slightly. "This is a life-changing offer, for you and your son." "I understand perfectly," Amara replied, her gaze unwavering. "My answer is no. This is my home. We are not leaving." She closed the door, the sound of the chains sliding back into place, a quiet declaration of war. She leaned against the cold wood, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had done it. She had faced the dragon and refused its gold. She had made her choice. She was no longer just a survivor, a victim of circumstance. She had chosen to become a guardian, a fighter. The moral crossroads had been faced, and she had chosen the harder path. From the window upstairs, she watched Davies speak into his phone, his expression now cold and angry. The brief, almost friendly facade was gone, revealing the ruthless machinery beneath. They knew now. They knew she wasn't just a squatter. They knew she was protecting something. The siege had begun. The fire station was no longer just her home. It was her fortress, and she was its sole defender against an army she could not see, but whose power she could feel gathering like a storm on the horizon. Amara's refusal of the $5 million offer was a point of no return. She had drawn a line in the sand, and in doing so, had transformed herself from a passive keeper of a secret into an active combatant. The pressure from Argent Development escalated almost immediately. It was a war of attrition, fought not with weapons, but with bureaucracy and intimidation. City inspectors began to appear with alarming frequency, citing her for dozens of fabricated code violations. Utility workers arrived with shut-off orders for non-existent accounts. Legal notices, thick with threatening jargon, were plastered on the station doors. They were trying to bury her in paper, to use the weight of the system to crush her. But Amara was no stranger to the system's callousness. She had been navigating its labyrinthine cruelties her whole life. This was a fight she knew how to wage. She spent her days at the library, Elias sleeping in his carrier beside her, teaching herself municipal law, property rights, and historical preservation statutes. She learned to fight their paper with her own, filing appeals, injunctions, and complaints. She was a one-woman legal defense team, fueled by coffee, desperation, and a growing sense of righteous fury. Yet she knew this was a battle she could not win in the long run. Argent had limitless resources. They could afford to wait, to bleed her dry, to eventually find a legal loophole to exploit. Defending the station wasn't enough. She needed a plan. She needed to understand Finch's true endgame. The logbook had given her the combination, but it felt incomplete. It was the how, but not the why. She became convinced that Finch, a man of such meticulous planning, would not have left the purpose of his fortune to chance. There had to be more. There had to be a letter, a journal, a final testament. Her search for this missing piece became her new obsession. She combed the fire station again, this time with a new perspective. She was not just looking for a hiding place. She was trying to think like Alistair Finch. Where would a man who distrusted institutions hide his most important document? Not in a bank, not with a lawyer. He would hide it in the one place he controlled, the place he loved. He would hide it here. She searched the chief's office again, tapping the walls, lifting the floorboards. She searched the library, the kitchen, the dormitory, nothing. Days turned into weeks. The pressure from Argent mounted. One night she was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a rock through one of the few uncovered windows on the second floor. It was a message. They were growing impatient. The next day she sat in the engine bay, Elias in her lap, feeling the first real pangs of despair. The building was so vast, the potential hiding places infinite. She looked up at the brass poles, dulled with age. She thought of Captain Miller's stories, of the firefighters living and working here, their lives intertwined with the building. Where was the heart of the station? Not the chief's office, a place of authority, not the dorms, a place of rest. The heart of a fire station was the readiness. It was the call to action. Her eyes were drawn to the old alarm bell system on the wall, a complex array of brass bells, wires, and levers that had once connected the station to the city's emergency grid. It was obsolete, a relic. But to Finch, it would have been the station's nerve center. She ran her hands over the cool brass, tracing the wires. Behind the main panel, tucked deep into the wall where the thickest bundles of wires entered the building, she felt it. A small, hollow space. Her fingers, small and nimble, found the edge of a loose panel. It was no bigger than a shoebox lid. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a long tin tube. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and slid the contents out. It was a sheaf of papers, tied with a faded ribbon. The top page was a letter, the handwriting the same elegant, deliberate script from the logbook. It began, "To whomever finds this, if you are a person of character, this city's last hope is in your hands." It was Alistair Finch's final testament. She read for hours, the words of a man dead for 60 years speaking to her with a startling, urgent clarity. He laid out his despair with the corruption of his time, his fear that the city's soul was being sold for scrap. He explained that he had liquidated his entire family fortune and converted it to the most stable, untraceable assets he could find: gold, bearer bonds, hard currency. He had built the vault to protect this wealth, this seed for a better future, from the locusts in pinstripe suits. But the most important part was the final section, his instructions. The money was not to be given to the city government, which he knew would squander or embezzle it. It was not to be given to charities, which he felt were often inefficient and self-serving. It was to be administered directly by a guardian. It was to be used to build things that would last: affordable housing for working families, free clinics for the sick, schools for the poor. It was a blueprint for a parallel city, a shadow endowment meant to heal the wounds inflicted by the official one. He had no heir of his blood, he wrote, so he was creating an heir of his purpose. The finder, he decreed, would be the first steward of the Finch endowment. The station itself was to be its headquarters. The final line of the letter struck her like a physical blow. Do not let the bell fall silent forever. The city must know that help is still on its way. It was a mission statement, a call to arms. Amara looked around the vast, dusty engine bay. She looked at her son. The path ahead was no longer dark and uncertain. It was illuminated, terrifyingly bright. She knew what she had to do. She had to build an army. Not an army of lawyers and bankers, but an army of the forgotten, funded by a ghost's fortune and led by a homeless mother. Her plan began to form, a daring, audacious strategy to fight Argent not by defending, but by attacking. She would not just save the fire station, she would resurrect it. Armed with Finch's testament, Amara was no longer just a defender. She was an executor. The document was more than a plan. It was a legal and moral weapon. Her first act was to quietly, carefully move a small portion of the vault's contents. One night, under the cover of darkness, she carried one of the smaller, heavier leather satchels down from the tower. It contained several gold bars and bundles of old high-denomination bills. The physical weight of it was immense, a tangible piece of the responsibility she now carried. The next day, she took a bus to a neighboring state, to a city where she was a complete unknown. She found a discreet private dealer in rare metals and currency. The transaction was terrifying. The dealer's eyes widened at the sight of the pre-1933 gold bars and the pristine gold certificates. But his greed outweighed his curiosity. She walked out with a cashier's check for a sum of money that still felt like a dream. It was a fraction of the vault's total worth, but it was enough. It was the seed. Her next move was to hire a lawyer, not a corporate shark like Davies, but a young, hungry, idealistic attorney from a legal aid background she found after weeks of research. His name was Ben Carter, and his small office was located above a laundromat. When she walked in and placed a retainer on his desk that was more than he made in a year, he was skeptical. But when she told him the full story, minus the exact location and contents of the vault, and showed him a copy of Finch's letter, his skepticism turned into a kind of awestruck belief. He saw the truth in her eyes, and he saw the fight of a lifetime. With Ben's help, the war against Argent Development shifted. They filed a countersuit, a brilliant piece of legal maneuvering that accused Argent of predatory acquisition tactics and harassment. But the centerpiece of their strategy was more audacious. They filed an application to have Fire Station Number 7 declared a protected historical landmark, with Amara, as the legal homesteader, named as its conservator. They used Finch's letter as the core of their historical argument, framing the station not just as an old building, but as the intended seat of a major philanthropic endeavor, a piece of living history. The legal battle that ensued was brutal. Argent's lawyers were a high-priced machine, and they threw everything they had at Amara. They dug into her past, trying to paint her as an unstable, indigent squatter, unfit to manage a lemonade stand, let alone a historical property. They tried to have her declared mentally incompetent. They tried to have child services take Elias away. Each attack was a fresh wave of terror, but with Ben's guidance and her own unshakable resolve, she held her ground. While the legal battle raged in the courts, Amara began to enact Finch's plan on the ground. She formed a nonprofit organization, a simple anonymous foundation, and then she started giving the money away. Her first project was small, almost invisible. She found a block of apartments in her old neighborhood that was on the verge of being condemned, its tenants, mostly elderly and low-income families, facing eviction. Through her foundation, she anonymously bought the building, paid for its complete renovation, and then deeded it to a newly formed tenants co-op, ensuring they would have safe, affordable housing forever. She fixed the broken heart of a community. Her next project was a free health clinic, established in a vacant storefront, staffed by retired doctors and young residents who believed in its mission. Then came scholarships for kids who had no other way to go to college. She never took credit. The donations came from the Bell Tower Foundation, an anonymous entity that became a source of myth and hope in the city's forgotten neighborhoods. She was fighting Arjun's vision of a city of glass towers with Finch's vision of a city of stable homes and healthy families. And she was winning. The community she was building began to fight back on her behalf. The tenants from the saved apartment building held rallies outside the courthouse. The families helped by the clinic wrote letters to the editor. She had built the army Finch had envisioned, and it was an army bound by gratitude and hope. The final piece of her plan was the fire station itself. Using the funds she had secured, she began its restoration. She hired local, unemployed craftsmen from the neighborhood to do the work. They replaced the windows, polished the brass, and painted the great red doors until they shone with a renewed pride. The ground floor, the vast engine bay, was transformed into a community center, a food pantry, and a temporary shelter for homeless families. She and Elias moved into the newly renovated living quarters on the second floor. It was a modest apartment, comfortable and safe. The fire station was coming back to life. It was no longer a tomb or a fortress. It was a beacon. The day the landmark designation was granted was a quiet victory. Arjun's case, built on the idea that the station was a worthless ruin, had crumbled in the face of its very public and very real resurrection. Mr. Davies and his black sedans disappeared from her street. They had lost. As winter approached, a year after she had first stepped through the station's door, Amara stood in the newly restored belfry. The great bronze bell, silent for half a century, had been cleaned and repaired. Below in the courtyard, the community she had helped knit together was gathered for a celebration. Captain Miller was there, his old eyes wet with tears. Ben Carter stood beside her, a proud smile on his face. She looked down at Elias, now a toddler who was taking his first wobbly steps, his hand clutching the leg of her jeans. He was a child of the station, a child of this legacy. Amara reached out and took the thick, braided rope. She pulled. For the first time in 50 years, the great bell of Fire Station Number 7 began to ring. The sound rolled out over the city, a deep, resonant, powerful declaration. It was a sound of hope. It was the sound of a promise kept. The inheritance was never the money. The inheritance was the mission. And as the bell rang out, Amara knew, with a peace that settled deep in her soul, that help at long last was on its way.